Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 294. Today is Sunday the 16th of February 2018, and this interview is with Latia Curry, whom I first heard and met speaking at South by Southwest. After spending 20 years in communications, marketing, government, and the world of international NGOs, Latia is currently principal at Rally, channeling her wide breadth of experience into laser-focused messaging, strategy, and campaigns. In this conversation, we discuss the objectives and challenges of inserting politics into your brand communications and general gestalt. We look at the keys to success, the pitfalls to avoid, the critical needs for integrity and persistence, issues of governance, and how best to persuade your stakeholders. Welcome to the Minter Dialogue podcast, where we discuss branding and all things digital. I am Minter Dial, your host, and you'll find the show notes on my eponymous site, minterdial.com. Enjoy the show. Latia Curry, it's great to finally have you on this podcast. I saw you at South by Southwest, and the topic, the way you talk about it, it's really passionate. So really thrilled to have you on this show. And in your own words, who are you?
Yeah. Well, as you said, I'm Latia Curry. I'm thrilled to be here with you. I'm a principal at a firm called Rally based in Los Angeles, California. And we're an issue-driven communications firm. So we work with foundations, nonprofits, and some corporations on navigating their communications through sticky political issues. So it's not electoral communications per se, but working on run-of-the-mill communications campaigns, but with a kind of political flair to it as it relates to issues in particular.
At some level, I mean, I don't even know if you need to use the word sticky, because just by nature of it, somehow it is that. You know, like in the end of the day, when one talks about you tell your kids, and your kid's only 1 year old, but you tell your kids, well, whatever you do, don't bring up sex, religion, or politics. And yet you've chosen to just dive full on into politics. Why is it, or how is it, that politics gets a pass as far as these three topics is concerned?
Yeah, I don't know that politics is getting a pass, and I don't know honestly that I would avoid any of those topics. It just depends on the situation. I think the current climate right now, especially when I think about the work that I do, is really driven at millennials who kind of demand a transparency about real issues that affect their lives and appreciate when organizations or individuals are really authentic in their stance and opinions about those issues. In addition, in a communications standpoint, it's very cluttered out here. And so in order to get attention to your issue, whatever it is, you got to be real and you got to strike a chord. And for us at Rally, one of the things we always talk about in terms of coming up with strategies for our clients, we develop for them what we call a provocative statement. And it's not shared publicly, but it's all about the heart of what you're communicating, emanating from something that's inherently provocative, because that strikes an emotional chord, not the head, but the heart of the consumers that you're trying to reach.
Well, I love that. I love the idea of getting a provocative chord. So when you talk about the millennials, for example, is it almost becoming table stakes that you need to present your political position? At some level, being authentic, if you can't speak about certain elements of your thoughts, are you therefore being inauthentic?
Yeah, I don't know if I would go as far as to say it's inauthentic, but I do think for millennials it's table stakes. I think many recent studies by Edelman and other sort of brand trust research firms have shown that millennials in particular are looking for this as a quality in the companies that they support with their dollars. And in fact, if those companies are silent, they will penalize them. So on the issues that they care about. So I think it's really important to think about what your values are as a company and align with those so that that authenticity is real. It's not some crafted kind of presentation to attract millennials, but because they'll know and they'll call it out, and they do call it out all the time. If you look at social media, it's happening every day.
So they're going to call you out if you have bad politics, but it's interesting, of course, this notion that not voting is voting, or not stating what you stand for is a position. And do you feel that millennials are calling brands out on that? And I mean, how do you weigh that? Because let's say if you are presenting, an unethical position, and you're presenting it, you're publicizing it, that's one thing, but not to say that is bad ethics doesn't seem to weigh as heavily as someone who is, outrageously bad. So how does one evaluate whether one should or should not get in?
Sure. So if I think about all of the examples of organizations who did not such a good job on this over the last year, it's usually because they were not proactive, and they sort of either were waiting in hiding, or they got caught off guard. Maybe in an interview, they were asked a question about the news of the day, and as an organization, they didn't have a prepared stance on it. Or if you go all the way to the extreme and you look at an organization like the NFL, they had lots of conversations about players kneeling and what that meant. And for, I believe it was 18 months, they didn't even make a statement really on it in terms of their position. And that, as we can all see, did not help them at all. Yeah. It actually made the problem worse. And by the way, it made it worse for both sides of the aisle. So when you think about the people who supported the players and the people who didn't, they were both not happy. And so what did that do for them as a brand? Even that polarization hurt them because they didn't take a stand.
I want to look at that notion. I almost want to call it lethargy in the way a senior team looks at that. And what is it that causes that 18-month gap? Things that I'm thinking about with my experience is, well, I don't know what I stand for. Or I'm out of touch, I'm thinking, with what actually is happening, or I'm shit scared.
Yeah.
What kind of lessons can we learn?
So I think for the NFL in particular, two things come to mind. One is really knowing your audience. Like, who do you serve? So even if you're a for-profit, you are in service to your customers and to your consumers. And I think they got confused about who their audience was. So you have a bunch of fans, and depending on what city you're in, those fans might feel differently about that same issue. But then you have the players as well as an audience. You have the owners as well as an audience. And so I think there was probably a lot of conflict internally about how to service their many audiences and do a good job at that. I also think that in terms of waiting 18 months, I think part of it is just fear of doing the wrong thing and alienating. And it's that old sort of mentality that, like, we don't talk about politics. We keep our head down. We do what we're supposed to do. That's not what our business is about. Right. And I just think that, in the current climate, you have to be in the flow of what's happening in current events and with your consumers. And if they are talking about these issues and you are not, you're actually creating distance between them and your brand. And I think that's a lot of why people don't act right away.
So what occurs to me in these things is that sort of decision making that happens in big business, and there's kowtowing and thinking and then re-meeting, and then there's the narrative that they want to have and all this stuff. And at some level there are two things that go through my mind. One is the legacy story, which is or maybe the bureaucratic story, where we have so many people and layers, and we're trying to please everybody, And then the other one is with regard to the lack of a defining individual. And not that I think you have to always have a defining individual, but at some level, if you're an entrepreneur, you're leading the company, you lead with your gut. You lead with your guts. You put your money, your line, your reputation, and your house on the line. And then when you feel it, it comes from within. These other guys, or gals, surely as well, somewhere, are trying to do the right thing. They're thinking it through, but they don't have any attachment to their gut. And I kind of feel that's one of the breakdowns that stops you being able to go with that, knowing that you're going to piss off one constituency, but that's life.
Yep. I would totally agree. I mean, again, it's head and heart. And I think when you look at an organization that people always refer to when talking about this, like Patagonia, you see so much heart and how it pays off in their business. So I think, again, it's just challenging this notion that, stick to the books and don't touch on these emotional issues. With those emotional issues actually allow for you to connect with people on a level that's not intellectual and that makes them have an affinity to you and your brand that can last in terms of loyalty for a long time. And so when you talk about those decision makers, I think whenever you see a strong leader or CEO who gets the gut piece as well as the head piece, they're usually doing fine, no matter what side they're doing. I mean, you could pick Chick-fil-A as well, who I tend to give a lot of examples on the left, but if you look at the right as well, Chick-fil-A is a perfect example of that. They have principles, they have values, and they stick by them, and they're not suffering for that financially. They know who their audience is.
And they've got a big enough audience.
And they've got a big enough audience.
Because you need to warrant it. On the other hand, when you have a really big audience where quote unquote, you're servicing 100%, which, let's say the NFL, the National Football League, is moving towards, they're in the mass market area. And as soon as you're at mass and you want to kowtow to the mass, you end up trying to be everything to everybody and then losing out your identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could say the same thing about the NBA, that they're handling it a lot differently because they're very clear on who their audience is. Their players come first. Their fans love those players and they orient everything around that. And I think the difference between the NBA in terms of the players, the coaches, the owners that speak out on issues, that do so unabashedly, again, isn't hurting them financially. And in fact, it's drawing people to the NBA who may not have been drawn to it because now it's like they put up like a light in the fog and now everybody can like attract to that light. If you're sitting low under the water being quiet, not only are you not pissing anyone off, you're not attracting anyone either.
That's not good for business.
Right.
So at one level, the conversation could scare people because we're talking about being, provocative and getting out on a limb on, quote unquote tendentious topics. On the other hand, it strikes me that pretty much every business is reliant on politics at some level. And, let's say the nasty word lobbies, but regulations that are dependent on Washington and America, but in general, politics. And even the judicial system has a role and an impact on the way you run your business. So isn't it almost not even just a question of table stakes from a consumer standpoint? It is that by nature, business is involved with politics.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. The distinction I would make, at least in the United States, is how public those activities are versus some of the other examples we've been talking about. So businesses have been lobbying for years. Right. They've been sort of in bed with politicians for years. They've managed to get bills passed in their favor forever. But I don't think that those things are as well understood and as publicized as when Chick-fil-A decides it's going to close on a Sunday because it's of religion. I think those things are much more tangible for people to grasp and react to one way or another. And those other pieces are just not I mean, the average person just doesn't know as much about those backroom dealings to say yay or nay. And I think there's a big effort now to kind of uncover a lot of that and be more transparent about that, especially given our current president. But I still think on some level, we're a very consumer society. So everything is, I think, consumeristic. So everything is rooted, I think, more around that when you look at the press and the media and what they're talking about most. So they're talking about Papa John using the N word much more than they're talking about, what's happening behind closed doors that helps set businesses up to be successful the way they are.
Well, back to another point you mentioned earlier, Latia, which is the notion of transparency. So there's a requirement of transparency on public issues, but in like a pharmaceutical company or a gun company, there's a whole lot of obscurity with regard to the way it works. And while I am certainly not a fan of our current president, there is this notion of unearthing what's happening and forgetting his politics per se. It's this notion of sort of taking off the shit and seeing what's underneath the hood. And maybe that's also going to contribute to helping make companies have to get off the pot.
Yeah, no, I think it's true, because one of the things that we think about, especially in the companies that we've advised, is aligning from top to bottom. So a lot of times, I had a client a corporate client who was very well positioned to talk about an issue that was pretty popular at the time, from the standpoint of them actually being 100% buttoned up on that issue, which was really rare, because not only did they have an opinion and a stance, they actually internally, when you audit their books, you could see every man and woman is paid equally. The sort of equity belief that they have in terms of how they treat their employees was backed up top to bottom. And I think as we work with them, that was one of the things that we wanted to push as a clarion call to other organizations to not just talk the talk, but you got to kind of do the homework inside as well, because people will demand that of you. And I will say, I mean, in our office, we have a ton of millennials, and there have been companies that we've talked about working with from a stance point of view, and then they'll show me like 50 articles that show like, here's what they really do in China. Here's what they really like. Millennials are on this. And so it has become more important that whatever is happening behind closed doors is above board, because that transparency will bring it to light.
When we talk about the ability for the employees to come on board, essentially you come up with a policy, you come up with an idea, provocative, we want to stand for this. The issue at some level is you didn't necessarily hire these people initially on that idea. So you've got a legacy group of people you're hiring. How do you, so for most companies, that's the reality. How do you go about, Latia, with your clients, bringing this up? How do you, let's say, well, we've done very well, we're doing fine, but, things could be better. We wish our content was more read, but we're plodding along. And we've never been political.
Yeah.
Give us an idea of how you can open that up, and what needs to happen. What are like without which sine qua non it doesn't work.
Yeah. So I can think of a recent client of mine who is a big tech company who had not been political really at all. But I really, really am strongly against this idea of, okay, time to get political. What are we going to do? Right. Let's pick an issue and then let's just write a statement and off we go. Right. I'm wholeheartedly against that. I think you have to look from within. And so what we did with them is we looked at things they were already doing just in their business, in their day-to-day business, and analyzed it through this lens. And we could see, here's where you're making a real social impact. So you're not, again, taking a stance and then trying to build a company to support it. Your company already is doing this. It's a matter of unearthing it from the inside so that it is authentic. And in that respect, then employees are not surprised. It's not like you're stringing it on them. There's something about that company that they like that drew them to the culture. It's just being articulated now in a new way that they will relate to, because it's not like some brand new thing. It's actually coming from them.
Get that. So then how do you qualify the success of something like this? Let's say, in the past we said, well, equality between women and men is important to us. We've said that in the past. Well, you unearth that. It seems like it's obvious. We actually do hire 50-50. How do you then monetize the efforts that go into it, whatever the stance? Because inevitably they have to go back to the shareholder and say, listen, we're now doing this, we're talking about that. They're going to get pushback. Wow, that's really risky. I mean, of course, let's say equality or diversity isn't risky. Gosh, surely, hopefully not. But, whatever that political stance is, you've got to find a way to value it. And, at some level, ultimately, shareholder value.
Yeah. So I think actually the distinction you just made is important. Not all issues are made equal. And there are some issues that are going to be a ton more palatable for your board or your shareholders than others. And that's just proven. There are just some issues that rise to the top in that way. And so with that example, with pay equity, that's not something that anybody who wants to be considered a respectable person would come out against, per se. But I do think in terms of valuing it, it comes from what I was talking about earlier in terms of differentiation, and specifically for organizations who want to target millennials. Now, if your organization doesn't want to target millennials, the issue that you're most aligned with isn't something that's really in the current events. It may not be necessary for you to develop a campaign. It may just be, a piece on your website that talks about your values as a company. There's a whole spectrum of activity that's proactive, and some of it is a lot more in your face than others. But for those who have issues that are relevant, have audiences that they want to talk to in terms of their business that also align with those issues, I think it's a pretty smart sell to your shareholders and your leadership and your board. I heard this a lot at South by Southwest when I spoke, that it's the leadership that needs to be convinced. And I think from that standpoint, it's a marketing play. It's really, truly a marketing play. I mean, one of the most interesting things I heard this year was Patagonia doing this ad about kids who were wearing their dad's Patagonia jackets.
Which had been refurbished and...
Right. It's like been passed down through the family. So from a business perspective, that's not good. We want you to buy more jackets, not pass the same one down forever. But Patagonia has been very clear that actually jump-started their sales. So I think if you look at examples like that, it's only when those things align, it actually can be a real positive on the business front.
So let's just look at, I want to think about a scale. Maybe you already have one, but when I say diversity or equality, I'm almost thinking that's political correctness. And as political correctness, as sort of like, it's as banal as it gets, even though it's not happening. So it's almost like, well, if you're not into that, you need to fire the HR person. And so that's just sort of respect normal. But so being that is nothing. Then let's talk about, well, I think the Second Amendment should be revoked. Now that's a little touchier topic. So how do you sort of look at that? And do you have a way for us to measure the scale and the, whoopsie daisiness of these topics that we have to deal with?
Sure. So I think it's not just looking at the topic. Again, it's looking at the audience and it's looking at the environment. So the diversity piece that you said was like kind of a political correctness. If you're not into that, you're weird. That, when done in a certain way, could ratchet right up to the top of the spectrum and be something that's super divisive and super polarizing, depending on how it's executed. So I think you have to think about audience and environment to be able to say on a scale of 1 to 10, how provocative and or risky is it for us to take a stance on this issue? And the other piece I would just say is your own company's values. So there are just some companies that have the foundational ability to speak on certain issues based on the nature of what they do as a company that gives them credibility, that gives them what I like to call issue fluency. So they know it, they're in it, they're immersed in it. And so even if you disagree with them, they as a brand are still intact because they're doing something that's completely aligned with their belief system.
I get that was a lovely clarification, Latia. When you're looking at these types of issues, one could think of being charitable, and other forms of marketing that goes, let's help the homeless, and let's spend money on that. And I spoke to a senior executive who was very keen to tell me that he encourages any charity, and I couldn't help but think that that's a waste.
Yeah.
Why, chasing too many rabbit holes? We're charitable to everybody. You can't be that. So when you look at a specific issue, let's say you're rooted, it's in your values, then the challenge that you were just mentioning before, which is this notion of passing it through the shareholder lens, and finding so that you can find a differential. But is there still not going to be the risk of the shareholder revolt and saying, we can't do that with the risk factor is too big?
Yeah.
And how do you overcome that risk factor, which is so tetanizing? So, it makes everybody close down, clamp down, and get very conservative.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is so specific to an individual company. The example that comes to mind for me, in addition, again, to audience and environment and your own values, is I have found, so before working at Raleigh, I actually worked on corporate partnerships at the U.S. Fund for UNICEF and matched corporate partners with initiatives around the world. And one of the things that we saw as an insight about what makes those companies tick and actually take these big risks on sort of very innovative ideas in Africa and India and South America is that they wanted to be at the forefront of something. They wanted to be viewed as an innovator leading on a particular issue. And so one company that comes to mind, they were basically offered an opportunity to end polio in India with their donation. So rather than them, and again, UNICEF could be something that's seen as exactly what you're saying, like homelessness, super politically correct, kids, vaccinations, who doesn't want to help kids under 5 in developing countries? Great. But when you frame it here's the impact that you as a corporate actor can have, and then you'll be able to talk about you're using your power for good, I think that's a very motivating factor, particularly coming from, like I said, the communication side of things. That's the kind of thing I want to talk about to the press when they're asking me about what my company is doing.
So I wanted to just circle back on it, which is how to make it successful. So when you are going in to see a client, are they calling you in, or let's say, what are the factors for success for making it happen? I mean, I'm thinking about their openness to your topic, or are they the ones leading the fray? Like the CEO has to be, full on. What are the elements that if you see not happening, you say, I'm out of here?
Yeah. Okay. So there are a lot of elements, but the ones that, if not happening, I'm out of here. And again, I can think of a couple of recent examples where we were approached by people that we decided not to work with for this very reason. So the first thing is consider your motives. Why are you interested in doing this? And it's not wrong to be thinking about it because it's something that companies and leadership are talking about everywhere. But if your motive is here's our opportunity to shine or get out ahead of our competitor, et cetera, and that's your only reason for doing it, 9 times out of 10, it's going to show through and it won't work because you don't probably want to invest in what it really takes to do and back up and prove the belief that you're positing to the public. So the first thing is considering your motives. I think the second is taking an inventory, like I said earlier, what are your values and what are you naturally doing and involved in that makes sense for you to get out front on? And most companies that I've worked with had that already. It was just a matter of pulling it out. And then the third thing I would say is not to wait. There's no head in the sand. You must be proactive. And as I said earlier, there's a spectrum of proactivity that I think even on an internal level, that tech company that I mentioned, like we trained all of their senior leadership on this topic internally before they were ever asked anything about it. So it wasn't in response to being attacked. It wasn't in response to anything. They were ready. They were an army of evangelists about the good work their firm was doing before they had been asked one question. So I think, like I said, there are different levels, but considering your motives, aligning with your values, and then being proactive are the three things that are the most important to set you up for success.
It's like do it before you say it.
Yes.
When you are at We Are Rally, or at Rally, I don't know how you call yourselves.
Just Rally. I think our website is We Are Rally because rally.com was taken.
Rally round the flag. Because therefore, at some level, there are many political issues. So Rally has to probably also make its selection and be strategic on what you focus on. What are the ones that turn you guys on?
Yeah, so our biggest issue focuses, and again, it's not limited because I think we're excited about the ability to make change using our toolkit, which is communications. But what comes to the top for us would be education, environment, and environmental justice specifically, healthcare, women's rights. So we've done a lot of work with Time's Up recently, but also reproductive rights with NARAL and Planned Parenthood. Those are the top four, I would say. And I think across the board, whether it's those issues or others, typically there's some through line around equity that is important to us as a value for our firm.
I love it. Well, you guys, Latia, I love your energy, and I love what you're trying to do, and that sort of integrity and the authenticity kind of just comes through as far as I'm concerned. Hopefully, the people who are listening, if you have, if someone wanted to try to get in touch with you, work with you, know more about you, what's the best way to reach you?
Sure. So our website is www.wearerally.com. And you can reach me at lcurry@wearerally.com.
Beautiful. And it's been a pleasure to have you on board, Latia, and I hope to have fairly more conversations, at least to stay in touch, because this is an important topic. Have a lovely day, Latia.
You too.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for having listened to this recording of the Minter Dialogue Show. You'll find the show notes and other blog posts on minterdial.com. If you enjoyed the show, please like the handy Facebook button, or better yet, head over to iTunes to give a rating and review. But first, relax to Josh Sachs's Finger Paint.
Oh, fill me with all your colors, any different way to rid me of the gray, and heal me with all your imperfections that you mention in your lack of self-security. Oh, I wouldn't care about the art form as long as you would feel warm, wrapped in canvas. Hold me tightly, slowly we would paint a lover's portrait with all your favorite shades, and we paint it with our fingers to show the world the way we feel. Oh, the way we feel. Oh, so messy. The ridges in our palms make colors blend and look ugly in the end, but they're pretty in their own disgusting values. We'd hang our portraits in the hallways, make our house guests cringe. Oh, I wouldn't care about the art form as long as you would feel warm, seeing all your colors on the canvas as we paint a lover's portrait with all your favorite shades, and we paint it with our fingers to show the world the way we feel. Oh, I know, and all these limitations, oversaturation. Let me paint, oh, let me paint, oh, let me paint, oh, let me paint, and I paint a lover's portrait with all your favorite shades, and we paint it with our fingers to show